Well, hello there. Welcome back to the channel. If you're a typewriter person, are you a perfectionist? Are you one of those people like me who has to correct every typographical error, no matter how small, be it a single letter? Stop, interrupt your train of thought, grab your correction tape, your correction tabs, your erasing pencil or whatever, and cover it up, type over the error, and then try to get back to your train of thought that you interrupted yourself. Well, if you're like me, I do like the appearance of a perfectly typed page, but on the other hand, I don't like what interrupting the typing process does to the whole writing process. So I've been thinking, maybe there's a better way than being a typing perfectionist. Stay tuned. It's nice to have a typographically perfect document, but think about what that does to the writing process, the constant interruption to the flow of thought. It's a real fragile connection from the brain through the fingers to the keys of the typewriter onto the page. Thought in the mind to ink on paper, that's a fragile connection. And interrupting it with every little technical typographical error can sometimes be detrimental to the writing process, especially if you're using typewriters in the early stages of the creative process where proper spelling, grammar, or whatever may not matter as much as it would in the final product. Yeah, if this was the mid-20th century and you were using a typewriter to produce finished copy, you're darn tootin', it should be typographically perfect. But for our purposes, usually in this day and age, for creative purposes, I'm having to retrain myself. I'm having to get out of that mold, that mindset. A lot of it depends upon the context and the uses to which you're putting your typewritten piece. If you are sending a letter to somebody or maybe a postcard, it might be nice to have it perfectly typed. Or even, for instance, on a blog that's to be typed and disseminated publicly. I've seen a lot of great looking typewritten pieces that have typographical corrections obvious, and it does not in any way detract from the readability of the piece. In fact, it kind of reveals the creative process at work, the correction and the revision and all that. So I think there's a good argument for being a non-perfectionist with typings. And I have an example here. So this was a page that I was typing up this week on my Groma Calibri, notes about upcoming videos that I might be working on. I actually had a breakthrough. I actually stopped midway and X'd out the word and retyped the word properly and just went on and lived with the fact that there was some X outs. And it doesn't change the quality or the context of the typing. It's perfectly readable. So if I'm going to accept the fact that I am a recovering correction perfectionist, then I'm going to have to come up with some ways of standardizing my methods of correcting. And there are several things to think about here. If it's a short word and I've caught the mistake right at the end of that word, I can X out the word and type it again correctly. However, if I haven't caught the error immediately and I went ahead and typed maybe the rest of the line and maybe went on to another line and only later noticed the error, then if I have enough room between my lines, if I'm typing like 1.5 or 2 line spacing, maybe I have room to X out, to go back roll the page, X out the errant letter or the whole word and type it in the space above the word. Depends if I'm single spacing, I don't have room to put that word in above. So it kind of depends on the context of how you're composing, how you're writing. Single line spacing, 1.5, double line spacing, and whether you catch the error immediately or not. But whatever you decide on, you kind of have to come up with some guidelines, personal rules for yourself for how corrections happen so you can get the thing corrected or X'd out quickly enough that you can get back to what you were thinking about and writing about, and it doesn't become a big old long convoluted distracting process. In the old days, the days of the typewriter in the 20th century, you would have to retype the page without a doubt. But we're not necessarily in that same place, and there's a whole nother kind of aesthetic around the raw, unedited look of raw TypeScript. It has its own aesthetic, its own look that people appreciate, and I certainly do. And there's a number of typewriter bloggers that I like their output. One of those is Vinny McFeets, whose blog is really a wonderful example of how he's able to make X-out type of corrections in the middle of the piece, and he makes it enjoyable to read, and it has a really great look to it, kind of an organic, working kind of piece. I want to do more of this. I want to find a way that I can do this better myself, for myself. But it's difficult for me to do this. It's not natural for me to want to leave errors in there because of maybe whatever it is. You can psychoanalyze my mind there, but I think I need to break out of that, and I think this is going to be fun to do. In my mind, there's a difference between typing over the wrong letter and continuing and correcting the word so it's readable. And that is the issue, is readability. There are certain letters that if you type them over with the correct letter, it becomes unreadable. And maybe if it's only a single letter, the reader can still decipher what the word was, but it makes the reading process a little more difficult, which is why I think it's better to strike out the whole word and retype it, especially if it's a short word, rather than trying to just type over individual characters. Now, I do have some examples here. When I'm writing just for myself, for my own journal, I will sometimes go ahead and just type over the errant character with the right character, knowing that nobody else is going to see it but myself. But I think if it's for public dissemination, I really want to strike out the word and either type it to the right of it if I've caught it in time, or type it above it in the space between the lines if I haven't. And here's an example of where I actually struck out the word and typed it. I caught it in time and I struck it out, and I just went ahead and typed the proper word and kept on, and it actually looks okay. It's quite readable. That's what I need to learn to do. Now here's an example where I used correction tabs to cover up or attempt to cover up the error and then type over it. And I usually use correction tabs on off-white paper. Like this is kind of a bluish gray marbled paper. So a white correction tape would just look like a big white rectangular blotch. It would look more unsightly than the error itself. You'll find though oftentimes that when you use the chalky correction tabs, you can't really easily type over it as clearly, and this is a great example. The imprint doesn't look as good, even when you go back and type over it a second time. And so, in this case, I should have just struck out the word and kept typing, and maybe it would have been fine. Now, here's an example of a one-typed page entry where I didn't catch the error at all until I think the paper was completely out of the typewriter, and I went ahead and threaded it back in the typewriter and tried to get it lined up fairly close and just typed the errant letter above it, right? So sometimes that's all you can do, especially if you didn't catch the error in time. So here is a personal typewritten journal article, and look at here. I made a mistake on the word perfect, and I struck it out and retyped it, and then I actually made a comment to myself, yes, I need to learn to make these corrections in the process of writing. So I think that's an interesting comment that I made to myself there in my typewritten journal. I think for me, part of the self-consciousness about leaving typographical errors on the page is because I went through typing class in high school back in the early 1970s, and it just seems wrong to leave errors, even though it doesn't really matter these days. I think it's actually better in some ways to show the rawness of your work, but there is part of it where it's like there is a performance aspect, like it's a skill. you should know how to do. You should be able to touch type on a manual typewriter without any errors. It's an expectation. If you can't create a error-free document, then you can't perform up to standard. So I think that's part of the mental pressure that I put on myself. Whereas really it should be about the creativity, the writing process, and don't let the mechanics of the writing process get in the way of getting those ideas out of your head and onto paper. I think that's the most important thing. This is something I'm trying to learn. It's not something I've succeeded at yet completely, but I wanted to encourage you guys, if you're in that place where you're interrupting your creative process because of the mechanics of the writing process don't seem to satisfy some kind of inner standard that you've set for yourself, maybe it's time to just relax, ease up on yourself, ease up on those standards, and just get the thoughts down on paper first. That's the most important thing. And be honest with yourself. None of us are speed typing champions, and it's not a competition. We live in a very competitive culture, and we like to rate our performance of every aspect of our culture against everything else. But creativity shouldn't be a contest. This is one of the reasons why I always disliked photo contests to begin with. How can you rate creativity with a point system? I think it's an idiotic idea, but that's just me. Well, I hope you guys got some value out of this. Let me know what you think. Are you an inveterate corrector? Does your copy have to be perfectly error-free? Or are you more loose and less uptight about it? And tell us your tips, and maybe you have some little personal rules about how you do your corrections and your strike-throughs or whatever. I know I was showing you X's on mine. Well, other people, of course, use slashes or other symbols. Let's talk about that as well. Leave some comments down below. I'd love to hear what you have to say, and love to have a dialogue with you. And until next time, stay well, stay creative, and have yourselves a great day. Bye-bye for now.